Talking about incident response on macOS. This is a pretty big topic. It's very deep topic, and we've only got, 45, 50 minutes. So, we're not going to be going really in depth here, but we're going to look at some very specific examples from actual malware as part of it. So let's go ahead and dive in. Before we get started, just a little bit about myself. My name's Thomas Reed. I work for Malwarebytes. I do a lot of threat research. I've been a Mac user since 1984, and I've been doing Mac threat research for over a decade now. So I've seen a lot of things over the years. You can feel free if you have any questions or anything after this. If we don't have time for questions, or if you don't have time to get yours answered, feel free to hit me up on Twitter, email, whatever. And just so you know, there is a link to the slides on the last slide, so you don't have to take pictures of everything. So just a little intro here. What we're talking about is not forensics. So we're not talking about collecting data for the purpose of, criminal investigations or any other kind of legal proceedings. If you want to do that sort of thing, you really want to make sure that you have, very good and complete data, and that it can stand the test of time. So you have to get everything you're going to need, because maybe it's going to be a year from now when you finally actually need to use it. And if you need that sort of thing, I recommend using some kind of a professional company to do it. There are a lot of very good companies out there that will provide you the tools and the expertise that you need. So what we're talking about is more on the side of IR. So you have a machine, you think it's infected. Maybe this machine is new to your environment. Maybe it's a friend's machine. Doesn't have antivirus, doesn't have any kind of monitoring software or anything like that. And you want to figure out what happened. Is it infected? If so, what did it do? What did the malware do? Where is the malware installed? Is it, exfiltrating data? That sort of stuff. So that's what you want to find out. And this is a much more short-term goal. And if you have physical access or remote access to the machine, which you would need for this sort of thing, then you can always collect more data later if you don't get everything. So how do we collect IR data? I've got a list here of some different scripts. The first one there, picked, that's one that I created recently, put it up on GitHub. It's a bunch of Python scripts built to be extensible, so you can write your own modules for it if you don't like what I did. But there are a lot of other really good tools, and they all have different strengths and weaknesses. So I encourage you to explore. So these are some other good options here: OSX Collector and Automactic, however you say that. And then those are more on the incident response side. There are also a number of good proactive tools that can monitor and log and take that data and upload it into something like Splunk so that you can monitor for suspicious behaviors. Richie Cyrus has got a really good one he released recently called Venator. Also, OS Query is really good at this kind of stuff. So you can actually avoid having to do some of this IR stuff if you have a proactive monitoring system in place. But for the purpose of this talk, we're assuming you don't. So I'm going to kind of breeze through this quickly so we have time to look at the more fun stuff here. So I'm going to just look at some of the basics of my tool just so that you know what we're looking at. We're going to, after we're done with this, we're going to look at 4 examples of actual malware and the data collected and how we can figure out what happened. So you can see here there's a screenshot of some of the data that my tool collects. It collects a whole bunch of aggregated data in some text files, as well as a dump of some system logs and some artifacts from the system. So it'll actually grab some of the files, things like browser extensions, your bash history, that sort of thing. And it collects it, a whole bunch of this stuff that you can refer back to when you're doing IR. So a few specifics here. It's got a basic info file that collects just a lot of very basic information, time and date that you ran the collection, list of users on the system, logins, which security measures are turned on or off, things like is file vault enabled, is system integrity protection turned on or off, that sort of thing. There's also a file where I enumerate all the files on the system with a limit. It does not actually dive into any directories that are protected by system integrity protection, because in theory those locations are immutable. You should not be able to modify them unless there's some kind of a vulnerability or SIP is turned off. But the most important information in here is really just the paths and the various timestamps created, modified, and accessed. There's also a lot of information about persistence. This is really key information when you're trying to analyze a malware infection, because almost all malware wants persistence. There are some exceptions. Not all malware does. Like there has been ransomware in the past that did not stay persistent. It just did, its encryption and then it was done. It doesn't care about persistence. But 99 times out of 100, it wants persistence. And when you look at all these different means of persistence, you can catch a lot of things. And some of these are fairly straightforward things that everybody's going to know to look for, and others are kind of a little sneakier. So things that we haven't actually seen malware doing, but it always could happen. Like, for example, adding some malicious commands to say your bash profile so that it gets run every time you launch the terminal. Nobody's done that yet, but it could always happen. We also want to look at browser history. So the script will collect browser histories from Chrome and Firefox and, of course, Safari. It will also collect from a database called Quarantine Events. This one is actually a database. Every time you download something that might have executable code, a zip file, an installer package, a DMG file, anything along those lines, it's going to be quarantined and it's going to go into this database. And so you can figure out if something malicious got downloaded, you might be able to find the direct link right to where it came from in this database. Install history is another good one. A lot of real malware is not going to use an installer package, but it's not unheard of. It can happen, and there's a lot of stuff like adware and pups that use installer packages extensively. So you can track that kind of stuff using this, the install history. Process info is obviously going to be really important here. There's a lot of information you can get just from the PS and LSOF commands in the terminal. PS can give you some really key information, not just process ID, but parent process ID. So you can use that to sort of build a chain of the process calls. This malware process has called this other one, which lets you connect some dots, and then LSOF lets you see things like what files have been accessed or are being accessed by the malware, what network connections are open or being attempted, all kinds of good information like that. This is really key information. And interestingly, I gave a talk about this earlier this year, and just by pure happenstance, this was right after the whole Zoom thing hit the news, and we were looking through some data, and I was like, oh, look at this. There's a Zoom opener process listening on a port Wonder what that is. Of course, it's that hidden little web server that Zoom so nicely installed on all Macs. There's also a file that will outline a whole bunch of suspicious behaviors, things like processes running from the temp folder or from a hidden location, or things like a launch agent or daemon plist that's named com.apple that doesn't really belong to Apple. That's a very common trick that malware authors use. And you can see here, Zoom got flagged again in my collection here because this nice little web server was running out of a hidden location. So Zoom was a wonderful example when I was given this class earlier this year. So all that out of the way, let's take a look at some very specific examples. So what I did is I took 4 different pieces of recent relevant malware, and interesting malware, and I detonated them on a test system, collected all the data so we could see exactly what it was doing. And then what we'll talk about is how do you trace exactly what happened and how it happened. So to start with, we'll start out with WireNet. This is also known as NetWire or NetWeird. It's been around for a while, but it was recently used in an attack against Coinbase and some other cryptocurrency companies through a Firefox 0 day that I'm sure you guys heard about. This is the first time this kind of thing has happened on a Mac in a while, where we had a vulnerability drop something on the system through a 0 day. So this is pretty interesting. And prior to this, NetWire or WireNet, whatever you want to call it, had not been seen since about 2014. So on my system, I infected with WireNet. The first place I typically will go to look is in suspicious behaviors, because that's if there's something in there, it's really interesting to look at. Sometimes it's not necessarily malicious like Zoom stuff, but very often you're going to find malicious stuff in there. So in this example, we see that there is a suspicious process running out of a hidden folder named .defaults. That dot at the beginning on macOS means that folder is hidden from the user. And we can see that process is running with a process ID of 529. We can also see there's a suspicious user launch agent. We don't know why it's been flagged as suspicious right now. The com.mac thing does look a little suspicious, but that's not necessarily bad. And we also don't know if these are related. Now, fortunately, the scripts also will collect all of these launch agent and daemon plists. So you'll have those available. You can go and refer to them. So you just grab that file, that com.mac.host.plist, and see what's in there. And right away you can see why that was flagged as suspicious as well, because it's running something from a hidden folder, from that .defaults folder. And you can see again here that it is responsible for that finder, that hidden finder process, which is obviously meant to mimic the Finder app for macOS, but it isn't really, because that doesn't run out of a user folder. So we want to find out a little bit more. A good place to go is the file info, all that enumeration of all the different files on the system, and that'll give us information about when those files were created, when they were dropped on the system. And you can see that they were created at about 8:26 p.m. So that's good information. That's UTC, not local time, which is, I try to get everything in UTC as much as possible, because then you don't have to worry about where was this machine, what time zone is it in, how does this relate to the time zone of this other machine that may have been on the same, may have been also affected. So UTC is a good thing to have. So now we can go and we can look a little more in depth, look at the processes, and we find something very interesting in the network activity. We see that the Finder process has a network connection open to some IP address. And we could go and look that up. If you went and looked that up now, you would find information about WireNet. But you might not actually find anything at the time if it's an unknown threat, if it's something nobody's ever seen before. But it does give you a nice piece of information. So what else can we do? Well, we've got the date and time that the files were created. So it's probably a good idea to take a look at the logs and see what else interesting happened around that time. So you can see here I used log show, which, with these new unified logs on macOS, they're kind of a pain in the butt. They're not just plain text log files anymore, like you would expect on Unix. They're binary logs. A lot of the data is not really readable, so you have to use the log command in the terminal to actually read this data. And so what this command does is actually shows the output of in the logs from a specific time frame. So from what is this, about 5 seconds, bracketing that creation time. And we can see something very interesting here. We see that there was something called finder.app that was running from the downloads folder. It was executed from the downloads folder during that time period. So that's most likely where the infection came from, how it got on the system. Now, I should say here that we don't know exactly where this Firefox Zero Day dropped the files. It probably was not in the downloads folder, but you would have been able to see wherever it was through the logs here. So you'd be able to tell where it came from. And so we can go and we can look at that finder.app in the downloads folder, see when it was created, which is, it gives you more information about the timeline. And this one's pretty simple. So that's pretty much the timeline here. You have that you know that the file was created on at 8:24 p.m. You know that a couple minutes later that it was launched. And then this finder.app in the user folder was created. In reality, what this malware was doing was just copying or moving that finder.app into that folder. And the launch agent was created. So that's when everything happened. And then at the time when we collected our data, we could see that there was a network connection that was actively open. And if you wanted to, if you were at the machine at this time and you see that, then you could go in there and do some more, digging, maybe, sniff the packets, do a network capture, that sort of thing, and get more information about what was going on there and what was going out over that network connection. So the next one we're going to look at is one called MOKES. Now, this, again, is related to the Firefox Zero Day attack because the attackers didn't just drop one piece of malware on the Macs that they compromised. They dropped 2. So the first of those was WireNet. The second one was MOKES. MOKES is another somewhat old one. We hadn't seen that one in the wild since 2016. So it's not quite as old as WireNet, but it's still older. In terms of malware. And so let's take a look. This one's a little bit more interesting. So I started out looking in the suspicious behaviors file and didn't really see anything there. There wasn't anything of interest. So my next place that I will always go to look is persistence. And so if I look in the persistence information, I immediately notice that there's a launch agent named storeaccountd.plist. This is a user launch agent. It's in user land, not a system launch agent, which is suspicious because this looks like it's something to do with, seems like maybe it's pretending it's something to do with the App Store. It also doesn't have the right name, because a launch agent or daemon plist is going to, it should be named com.companyname.programname.plist or something along those lines. Not everybody follows that rule like they should, so just because it doesn't immediately mean that it's bad, but it's definitely something we want to look at. So we're going to go grab that file out of the artifacts folder and take a look. And we notice that it's running something called store account D out of a folder in the user folder called App Store. That's immediately, there's nothing good about that. It's pretending to be the App Store, but the legit App Store processes would be running out of system directories, not the user folder. So we know, at this point, there's nothing good about that. So let's dig a little deeper and look in the processes data, and we can get the process ID, which is 495. We see the parent process ID is 1, which is launch D. That is the parent process for just about everything, and certainly it's the parent process for something loaded via a launch agent. So makes a lot of sense. That's totally logical. We can also see that it was launched at 5:34 p.m. local time. Local time's a little bit of a problem because we want everything in UTC, right? So, and maybe we don't know what time zone this machine was in. So what do we do here? Fortunately, that basic info file we mentioned earlier, the very first line in there tells you when the collection was done, and it gives a date and a time both in local time and in UTC. So that's your map. You can use that to map whatever, any of these local time values that you might get into UTC. So we can see that this actually happened at 7:34 p.m. UTC. So that will help us match up with the other UTC times we'll have. So now we can go back and look in file info, and we can see when these files were created. You can see that they were created at same time, 7:34 p.m. UTC. So we can also look for network activity here, and we see that at the time we did the data capture, that there was a connection that was had been attempted to an IP address, but there had not been a response yet. So we know that it's trying to contact some server, but it hasn't heard back yet, possibly because that server's been taken offline already, which would make sense since this was existing malware that had already been detected and was known about in the wild. So we can also look at what's going on with the file activity, and we see in this case that there is a 0-byte file with a long cryptic name that's open. We don't really know why at this point. We might suspect that this is some kind of a marker file. Maybe that name has some encoded information in it somehow. We don't know what that might be, but we'd start having some suspicions about that at this point. Now, in reality, we know, because we know about MOKS, we know that what that file actually is it is a marker, and it indicates which variant of MOKS is installed on the system. There are a whole bunch of different name variants. So store account D in an App Store folder is one of them. It also has other processes with other names, things that try to make the user think that it's related to the dock or that it's related to, other legitimate macOS processes. And that string, whatever data is encoded there, it tells it which variant that is. But we wouldn't know that at this point. So it's just a neat thing to know about. So we can go and we can see when that file was created. If this were something else, like if this were some file that maybe was being filled up with data, we could, this would be really useful information. We could see when it started collecting data. We could see when it had been accessed, that sort of thing. So we could get a little bit more clear picture of exactly what time frame that file had been active for. We also, like we did with WireNet, we want to go and look in the logs and see what else might have happened around the time that these files were being created. So we search for within a, what is that, a 10-second window this time. And we see that there was something called Mac, some executable called Mac that was run from the user folder, which that's suspicious. Yeah, you would not expect to see that. And we can see what time that happened. We can see what process ID it was launched with. So let's get more information about that. We can go and we can find out that file was actually, it's still on the system at the time that we did our capture, and that it was created at 7:32 p.m. That's probably where the malware came from. Now again, we don't know where this file would have been dumped by the Firefox 0-day. We just know it was dumped on the system somewhere and executed. User folder might be a reasonable location. A temp folder might also, but for the purpose of this demo, it doesn't really matter. We'd be able to tell where that file was. And so we can reconstruct the timeline here. We see that the file, the initial dropper, was created on the system. We can see what time it was launched, just a little more than a minute later. In the real world, that probably wouldn't have been a minute. That minute was how long it took me between copying the file in place to launching it. So, and then just seconds later, we see that it had created store account D and the launch agent plist file. We see just shortly after that the marker file was created. And, again, if that were some exfiltration data file that was being created, we could see when it was created, when it was continuing to be accessed, and get sort of a window of time. And then at the time we did our data collection, we can see there was that network connection that was still waiting a response. All right, so the next one is unrelated to the Firefox 0-day now. So it's one called Bird Miner. I think you probably know right away just from the name. It's a cryptocurrency miner. So I am spoiling a little bit of the details for you here, but I couldn't have hidden it without hiding like all detail about even the name. So this was actually distributed through a whole bunch of pirated audio software that was being distributed through a crack site. So people would go there, they download, some pirated audio app, and they install it on their system. They actually get the app, so they get they get their free cracked audio app, but they get a little extra something in addition. Yeah, well, yep. He said no, there's no such thing as a free meal, but they did get something for free. Now, this also uses a very interesting obfuscation technique that we're gonna figure out here. So once again, we start with suspicious processes and we see nothing. So we go to our fallback, which is persistence. And right away, these three weird launch daemons hit you in the face practically. I mean, you don't see words like this typically on a macOS system. com.heteroneura.plist, one called muckden, and one called tang. Those don't look legit at all. So of course we're going to dig into those. And we look at those and we see that the first two launch processes out of sort of randomly named folders. So one of them launches a process called AHT from a folder named per, P-E-R. Another one launches something called Fulgora out of a folder named Q. So not at all suspicious, right? And then the third one actually launches something that was placed in user local bin called Aegean. So lots more things to look at here. We're getting a lot of data, lots of things to find out about. So if we look in processes, we can track a bunch of this stuff down. We can see process IDs for all three of those things, and we can see that they were all run by bash. So whatever they are, it looks like they're bash scripts. We can also see what time they were launched in local time, and of course we can go back to basic info and map that to UTC. So we know that this was 11:36 a.m. UTC. And we can see that Aegean was actually launched just a few minutes later for some reason. We don't know why yet. We can also, if we keep digging around in processes, what we can do is we can take those process IDs we got for those three processes and search for those. And we can find, oh, look, these are all parent processes of something else. So AHT is a parent process of something called PER, P-E-R, named just like the folder that we saw. Fulgora is a parent process of something called Q, again, just like that folder. And Aegean is a parent process of sleep. So something must be, recurring here, and it's something happens and then it sleeps, and then happens again and then sleeps. If you look at the launch agent or the launch daemon files, you'll find that what's actually happening here for Aegean is the launch daemon will launch it and then exit after it sleeps. But because the launch daemon has a keep alive property, it means that as soon as the process exits, it's going to relaunch. So basically it launches, does its thing, and then sleeps, and then exits, and then goes back around again. It launches. So this is kind of a way of running this process on a periodic basis. So if we look at PER and Q, both of those processes seem to be using a significant amount of processor time. So in this case, this was just a demo, so it's not like they were sitting there for weeks. In this case, they were sitting there for 7 minutes before I did the data collection. And in that 7 minutes, they each were using about 5 minutes and almost 20 seconds worth of processor time. In a 7-minute time period, that's probably not that significant. It could have been doing something, like initializing something, we don't know. But if you observe this over time, that would continue. That processor time would keep going up. And that would be an indication that this is probably a crypto miner, right? So we're starting to get this idea that maybe this is mining some kind of cryptocurrency. We can also see from the process data, it actually gives us all the arguments that these two processes were launched with. And there's something very interesting there. It's got all these command line arguments here, and these look kind of interesting. So first thing you'd probably want to do is take this information and go look it up on Google, right? Or some search engine. And if you do that, if you take Excel equals HVF and search for that on Google, the first 5 hits you're going to get are for something called QEMU. And it turns out that's a Linux virtual machine. So something here is running QEMU, and it's running a Linux system in emulation, which is very interesting. And that means that these files, Stercorarius and Kenchi, that are being passed as parameters, those are probably VMs. And if you actually go and look in the file info, you'll see they're fairly large files. Now, at this point, we're pretty sure they probably are crypto miners, but we don't have 100% certain evidence. But if you can get access to that system, if you still have the access and can still go back and collect additional files, you can grab those files, you can launch them in your own instance of QEMU and take a look inside. And if you do that, you'll find that the bootlocal.sh file in those two Linux systems has this code in it. And you'll see the very last line there says xmrig, which is a popular open source crypto miner. So there's our smoking gun. This is definitely a crypto miner. Now, we can also find out where this is trying to communicate to. So we can look at the network info from LSOF, and we see Per and Q both have connections open to a subdomain of njlla, however you say that, .net, which is some hosting service. I'm not sure if it's a legit hosting service that was being abused, or if it was, totally malicious from the start. But we can see the domain name and we can see the IP address. The IP address is actually listed there, but if you don't trust that, the IP address in the domain, you can just do a lookup and find that's actually the correct IP address. And then you can look into the file info and see when all these files were created. And we can see that the AHT and Fulgora files were created on at 11:36 a.m. We don't have any data on when that Augean file was created, unfortunately. So if you remember earlier, I told you that this file in my script actually skips any directories that are protected by SIP. User is protected by SIP. And unfortunately, that means the whole directory gets skipped, even though there are some directories under it that are not protected by SIP. So not the end of the world, especially if you have access to the system and could go back and grab the data that you missed. But maybe it's something that needs to be looked into at some point in the future for an improvement to the script. We can also see when the VM files, Stir-Corarius and Canchi, were created. They were created at 11:38 a.m. And finally, we can look at the installs file, and that's got some interesting information in it. It looks like something called Valhalla Vintage Verb was installed. That's an interesting name, but it is actually apparently a legitimate audio program that had been cracked by somebody and put up on this piracy site. So this was installed, and we can see that it was installed at 11:36 a.m., a little bit before all this bad stuff was happening. Now, we probably want to look and find out where this came from, so we can look at the history, the browser history files, and we see in Safari that this site called vstcrack.com was visited at 11:31, just a few minutes before Valhalla Vintage Verb was installed. So that's probably where this came from. We don't know, there's no smoking gun yet, but it's a pretty good bet. So what I'd really want to do is look in the downloads info, the information from that quarantine events database, because that could tell me the exact URL that .pkg installer file was downloaded from, because that should be in the quarantine events database. Unfortunately, it's not in there. The last entry is in there is for Firefox, and that's definitely not it. So unfortunately, the problem with this quarantine events database is that it is extremely unreliable for Safari for I don't know what reasons. If you download a file in Firefox or Chrome, it'll immediately go into that database. If you download something in Safari, it could be days or weeks before it actually makes it into the database. So that means there's kind of a little hole there where if somebody's downloading stuff through Safari, you may not be able to actually get the real URL, unfortunately. So if we reconstruct the timeline here, we can see that at 11:31, that VST crack site was visited. We see that a few minutes later, Valhalla Vintage Verb was installed, which is a legitimate program, but later just seconds later, we see that these the malicious processes were created and launched, and we see that these VM files were created and opened. So that's definitely not supposed to happen when you install this program. And finally, at the time that we collected our data, we can see there was a network connection open from both of those two processes. So very interesting. We got a pretty decent look at what was going on, and this is good information to help you track down other infected machines in your environment. So the last one we're going to look at, it's not as recent, but it's interesting because it's still an ongoing case. So Fruitfly was a general purpose backdoor that was used to infect Macs for over a decade before it was discovered. And it was very, very creepy. The guy was using it to record people through the webcam and through the microphone. He's been accused of, among other things, creation of child pornography. And fortunately, this guy was actually caught by the FBI. They got him, they got his laptop, all of his hardware. He's currently in prison up in Cleveland. He's still awaiting trial. It's been kind of dragging on for the last couple of years. But the evidence against him is strong. So let's take a look here. So we've got a system, it's infected. We don't know what it is yet. So we'll look at suspicious behaviors, and right away we see there's a launch agent in there called com.client.client.plist, but we don't know why it's suspicious yet. So let's take a look at that file. And we see that it's suspicious because it's launching a process out of a hidden .client file in the user folder. So that's highly suspicious. That's not normal behavior. We also see that it has the NSUI element flag set in the plist file, which means that this will not show up in the doc. So that's another sort of suspicious piece of information. So if we dig a little deeper, we look in processes and we find, well, wait a minute, there's nothing named .client running in the process list. So what's going on here? And we can look in persistence again, and there's actually, my scripts will collect the output of launch control list, which gives you a process ID. So we can see that launch agent plist launched something with a process ID of 536. So we can go back and we can take a look at processes and we say, well, there is something with that process ID, but it's called Java, not .client. So what is this? It looks like maybe .client is something that's running Java. Not sure yet. So we dig a little deeper and look in the file activity here. And we see that for that process ID, the file is actually listed here, and the command is listed as Perl. So that suggests this is a Perl script that's running and running Java. And if you actually were able to collect that file, that .client file, and take a look at it, you'd find it is a Perl script with a data section at the end. And in that data section, there's a macOS binary, there's another Perl script, and there's a Java class. And these are all extracted by the script and executed. So let's find out when this file was created on the system. We can look at the file info data for that, and it's pretty clear. It was about 7:38 p.m. And we want to find out where this came from. So we take a look at the install history. We look at the browser history. We look at everything that we can that might tell us where this came from, and we find a whole lot of nothing. So how do we, doesn't look like this was downloaded and installed by the user. Doesn't look like it was probably from a 0-day, maybe, maybe not. So let's dig a little deeper. If we look at the bash history, then there's something really interesting there. You can see somebody's doing chmod +x.client. So somebody's making it executable. Somebody's trying to load it with launch control. They're kind of fumbling around a bit, repeating some of these commands over and over, and then checking the results and then trying again. And finally, they must get it right and log out. And we don't know, we may not know if that was physical access or remote. The log out at the end, though, suggests remote. So let's try and find out more about that. If we look in the system logs for that time period, and we've bracketed about 20 seconds here, there's something really interesting there. You can see SSHD had it had a connection open for user test from a local IP address, and we can see what time that happened. So somebody had used SSH to log into this machine, run a bunch of commands, and we can see that those commands were responsible for dropping the malware on the system. And this is exactly what Philip Durachinsky, the accused author of this malware, did for 10 years. Technically, this is from an FBI flash document that was TLP Amber, and as far as I know, still is. But somebody put it up on a website publicly, so I don't feel too bad about giving you a screenshot. So basically, this guy was known to find passwords, find credentials from data breaches, and use them to attack people's computers and get into them. So that was really interesting and creepy and a little different than most malware these days. So if we look at the timeline here, it's pretty simple. We see there was an SSH connection at a particular time. You see that shortly after that, the .client file was created. You'll see there was this interval of time during which all those commands were being executed, trying to get .client loaded and running persistently on the system. And then finally, at the time of collection, we could see that this Perl script was running something at least related to Java on the system persistently. So that's pretty good. Pretty good information. We can use that. And that's the conclusion here. As I said, this was really a very high-level skim over this topic. There's tons more information. I gave a full-day workshop on this earlier this year, and even a full day is not at all remotely enough time. So I encourage you, dig into this yourself. Please feel free to ask me questions. You can find the slides with my contact info, my GitHub, everything right there. I welcome any questions now or later. So anybody have any questions? Yeah. So for training purposes, you can actually use a VM. You can run macOS on a Mac in VMware or Parallels. But you could also just get a little Mac Mini, hook it up to a monitor and a keyboard and a mouse and use that. Nice thing about the Mac, recent versions of macOS have a new file system called APFS. You can do a snapshot with APFS, detonate whatever malware you want to do, do your analysis, whatever you want to do, and then just reset it. It's almost like a VM. So it's very slick, very nice. And of course, if you're actually detonating real malware on it, you're going to want to keep it on an isolated network so it can't see all your other stuff. Any other questions? All right, I think we're about out of time here. So if you do have any other questions, feel free to grab me in the hall or email me later. Thank you.